They told me the Vance farm was a lost cause, a dead property, a failed dairy farm, a piece of land that had outlived its usefulness and a family name that had outlived its honor. At 72, I came here expecting to sell the old timber, the loose stone, and whatever scrap value the place still held. I did not know I was walking into a crime scene that had been waiting 50 years to be opened. The trapdoor was hidden beneath the pantry rug. The tunnel ran 30 feet into the dark, narrow, and reinforced colder than the farmhouse above it, as if the earth itself had been keeping a secret. And at the far end, sealed inside a wall niche and untouched since 1979, was a rusted milk urn. I brought it into the light with both hands. Inside was a rolled parchment, old, dry, still intact. I unfastened the cord and opened it carefully. At the top in bold black letters was a name. Property of Eleanor Vance, June 12, 1928. That was the moment I understood Nell Vance had not lost this farm because of drought, bad luck, or bad business. She lost it because someone she trusted decided her silence was easier to steal than her voice was to fight. And before they pushed her out, Nell hid the truth where only someone willing to dig beneath the house would ever find it. She had been waiting 50 years, and somehow without knowing it, I had come to answer her. The drizzle had started somewhere around mile 40 and had not decided to become rain or stop being drizzle by the time Iris pulled off the county road onto the gravel track that led to the Vance farmstead. She sat with the engine running for a moment, looking through the rain-spotted windshield. The farmhouse was white clapboard, 2 stories, the kind of construction that announced its purpose without apology, built for work, not for impression, every line utilitarian, every proportion determined by function rather than aesthetic preference. The roofline was true, the foundation visible at the base of the front elevation where the ground had settled away from it over decades, was solid dressed stone. Someone had built this farmhouse to last, and had succeeded, which was more than could be said for the fencing along the road line, now present in spirit more than structure, or the dairy barn beyond the house whose red paint had faded to the pale rust of a color remembered rather than maintained. The lawyer's voice came back to her as she cut the engine. The back 40 was sold decades ago. You only own the house and the small barn. A pause that carried the weight of professional sympathy without personal investment. It's a skeleton of a farm, Iris. I want you to understand that before you make the drive. She had understood it. She had made the drive anyway. She got out into the drizzle without hurrying and stood on the gravel for a moment, doing what she had always done when she arrived somewhere new, letting the place present itself before she imposed any categories on it. 40 years of field botany had given her this habit, and she trusted it. You did not understand terrain by rushing it. You stood in it and let it speak at its own pace. The fields beyond the barn had gone to meadow. She noticed this immediately with the particular attention of someone who knew what unmanaged agricultural land looked like at different stages of succession. These fields were 30-40 years into the process, the grasses well established, the woody plants beginning to assert themselves at the margins, the whole composition moving towards something that would eventually become woodland if left alone. A botanist's eye saw it as information. These fields had not been farmed since the late 1970s or thereabouts. The timeline matched what the lawyer had told her. She walked to the front gate. The mailbox post was still standing, the box itself intact, but she stopped at the gate and looked at it for a moment before she opened the latch. The metal surface of the post had been painted over. She could see it in the texture, the way the paint had been applied thickly in one section, building up over whatever had been there before. She ran her thumb across it. Underneath the paint, the ghost of letters not legible, but present. Something had been written on this post, and had been covered over, deliberately. She filed this and went inside. The kitchen was the first room, and it told her most of what she needed to know about the farmhouse's character. Everything in it had been built for use, the counters deep and practical, the shelving heavy gauge, the table a working surface rather than a dining statement. The floor was wide plank oak, the boards thick and dense with age darkened from decades of farm boots and hard winters. It sagged slightly toward the pantry, a gentle, consistent slope, that spoke to long-term settling rather than structural failure, the kind of movement a sound building makes over many decades as it negotiates with the ground beneath it. The smell was dried hay and cold stone, and the particular mustiness of a house that had been closed for a very long time without being damaged. Not neglect exactly, suspension, as if the farmhouse had simply been waiting in the patient way of well-built things for someone to come back. She moved through the ground floor methodically, the parlor sparse, functional, a stone fireplace with a plain surround. The dining room, a table, 4 chairs, a lamp with a cracked shade still on the sideboard. No decorative objects anywhere, no family photographs on the walls, no accumulated personal objects of the kind that accumulate in houses over generations. The rooms had been cleared before the last person left, or had never been filled in the way of houses where the occupant's energy went entirely into the work rather than the interior. She went back to the kitchen and looked at the walls. The Vance name was nowhere in this house. She had noticed this arriving the mailbox post painted over the gate, hardware bearing no identifying marks. Inside confirmed it. No embroidery, no carved lintel, no painted sign above a doorway of the kind that farm families sometimes installed to mark their property as theirs. Whatever name had been on this farmstead had been removed from every surface accessible to casual observation. She was standing near the kitchen door making a note of this when she noticed the plaque. It was small, perhaps 4 inches wide, 2 inches tall, a piece of pine attached to the wall behind the door at a height that would be completely invisible when the door was open, and only visible when the door was closed and you were standing close enough to the wall to look directly at it. She had closed the door against the draft and happened to be standing in exactly the right position. 2 letters carved into the wood with a small blade. Careful, deliberate, the cuts clean. NV 1938. She looked at it for a long moment. Her uncle had always referred to this property as the Silas Vance farm. Silas, that was the name attached to the family history she had been given. But NV was not Silas. N was not S. Whoever had carved these initials into the back of this door in 1938 had a first name that began with N and had carved them in a place where they would not be found, unless someone closed the door and stood close and looked directly. She photographed the plaque and straightened up. The kitchen floor continued its gentle slope toward the pantry. She followed it. The pantry was a working room, deep shelves on 3 walls built for serious storage, the kind of shelving that had held preserves and dry goods through decades of farm seasons. Empty now, the shelves dusty, the hooks along the top rail bare. But on the floor, taking up most of the available walking space, a heavy braided rug. She had noticed the rug from the kitchen doorway and registered it as unremarkable. Now, standing in the pantry, she noticed something else. The rug was bolted down, not tacked, bolted with 4 flathead bolts countersunk into a wooden border that ran around the rug's perimeter. The heads rusted to the same color as the surrounding floor, so that they were nearly invisible unless the light caught them at the right angle. She crouched and examined the nearest bolt. The rust was old, the kind that accumulated over decades rather than years. These bolts had been here for a very long time. She found a flathead screwdriver in her bag and worked the first bolt. It turned with effort, not seized but resistant the rust, providing friction rather than permanent lock. The second bolt was the same. The third and fourth came more easily once she understood the resistance. She lifted the border and folded back the rug. Underneath a trap door. The same wide plank oak as the kitchen floor fitted so precisely into the surrounding boards that the seam was nearly invisible, visible only because she was looking for it, because the bolted rug had told her something was worth looking for. No handle, no ring, just a finger hole bored through the plank at one end, the edges worn smooth and slightly darkened from years of use. Someone had reached into this hole many times. Someone had come and gone through this floor regularly over a long period and had bolted a rug over the evidence every time. Iris sat back on her heels and looked at the finger hole for a long moment. If you want to know what's under those floorboards and why the Vance name was erased from every surface of this farm, stay with me. Iris did not open the trap door that morning. Not yet. She sat back on her heels in the pantry, one hand resting near the worn finger hole in the floor, and understood that the house had already given her 2 kinds of evidence. One was physical, the painted-over mailbox post, the hidden plaque behind the kitchen door, the rug bolted over a trap door that had clearly been used for years and then hidden with care. The other was absence. No family photographs, no carved sign, no Vance name where a farm family would usually leave one, no visible trace of the person who had built a life here except the initials NV carved where no casual visitor would ever see them. Iris had spent 40 years studying plants, soil, and field records. She knew that absence was not emptiness. A missing species in a meadow told a story. A line of old trees where no fence remained told a story. A field gone quiet for 40 years told a story. So did a name removed from every surface of a farm. By 10:30, she was at the county registry. The building sat beside the courthouse red brick low steps, brass handles worn dull by generations of hands looking for proof. Inside, the air smelled of paper toner and old decisions. A woman at the front desk directed Iris to the land records room where a row of public terminals sat beneath framed county maps that had yellowed unevenly in the light. Iris asked to see the transfer history for the Vance farmstead. Full parcel or remaining parcel, the clerk asked. Iris looked up. That's already an interesting question. The clerk gave a small smile. It usually is. The first record was what the lawyer had described. The house, the small barn, and a reduced parcel remained attached to the inherited property. But the back 40, the best land according to the old soil maps Iris had reviewed the night before, had been separated decades earlier. The transfer date was 1978. From Vance Holdings to North-South Railway expansion. Purchase price $1,200. Iris read the number twice. Even in 1978, $1,200 for 40 acres was not a sale. It was an insult wearing a receipt. She leaned closer to the screen. The signer line read, Eleanor Vance, per Silas Vance, power of attorney. Iris sat very still. Power of attorney. Eleanor Vance would have been 76 in 1978. Old, yes, but old did not mean incapable. Iris remembered her mother speaking of Nell Vance only a few times, always with a kind of irritated admiration. Sharp as a tack, her mother had said once. Knew every cow by temperament and every acre by drainage. You couldn't fool Nell Vance on her own land. So why would that woman give her brother power of attorney to sell the richest back acreage of a thriving dairy farm for pennies? And why had the farm been described to Iris as a failure? A voice behind her said, That record always bothered me. Iris turned. The woman standing behind her wore a county archive badge clipped to a gray cardigan and carried a folder against her chest. Her hair was silver at the temples, her glasses hung from a chain, and her expression had the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to say too much before knowing who was listening. Beatrice Lowe, she said. Most people call me B. Iris Thorne. I know, the Vance farm finally found an heir. That seems to depend on which record I'm reading. Bay looked at the screen. Yes, she said quietly. That's usually where the trouble starts. She led Iris into the archive room behind the public terminals. It was cooler there, the lights dimmer, the shelves heavier. Bee moved through the stacks with the confidence of a woman who knew not only where the records were, but which records had been misfiled by people who hoped inconvenience would become disappearance. You're looking at the 1978 transfer, Bee said. I'm looking at a woman supposedly signing away 40 acres through her brother for $1,200. Not through a lawyer. The record says power of attorney. Bee's mouth tightened. That's what I remembered. She pulled a narrow file box from a lower shelf and set it on the table. Inside were county medical summaries, fair registrations, production records, and scanned copies of public notices from the late 1970s. Nell Vance had no recorded illness in 1978, Bee said. No guardianship proceeding, no competency review, no hospitalization record in the public index. She opened a folder and slid a page across the table. County Fair Dairy Division. September 1978. Iris read it. Eleanor Nell Vance, first place butterfat production, second place herd management, special commendation, small dairy efficiency. Bee tapped the page with one finger. She was winning blue ribbons the same year she supposedly needed her brother to manage her legal affairs. Iris looked at the fare entry, then back toward the transfer record.
That doesn't fit!
Nobay said. It never did. The next folder contained milk production reports. Iris expected decline, abandonment, failing yields, a farm collapsing under debt or age. Instead, the columns told a different story. The Vance Dairy was one of the top producers in the county through most of the 1970s. Not the largest, not the most modern, but steady, efficient, profitable. The report showed consistency where the family story had suggested collapse. This farm wasn't failing, Iris said. Nobay said. It was thriving. Iris turned another page. The numbers were clean. Month after month, year after year, Nell Vance had not been losing the farm. She had been running it. So why sell the back 40s? Bea did not answer immediately. She reached into another folder and removed 3 newspaper clippings, each protected in a clear sleeve. Silas Vance, she said. The first clipping was from 1977, a small column about unpaid debts connected to the local horse track. The second mentioned a civil claim. The third, dated early 1978, named Silas Vance in connection with a failed investment scheme that had left several local families unpaid. Iris read them one by one. There it was.
Not drought!
Not bad luck. Debt. Silas had needed money. And in 1978, Eleanor Vance's back 40 had been sold for $1,200 to a railway expansion project. Iris looked back at the transfer record. Do you have the actual sale document? Bea nodded. I pulled it when I saw your appointment request. She opened the final folder and removed a photocopy first, then a protected scan of the original. The 1978 sale document looked ordinary in the way dangerous documents often looked ordinary. Names, parcel descriptions, legal language stamps, signatures. No drama, no confession. Just a page that had quietly changed the ownership of land. Bea placed it beside the fair entry form from the same month. Look here, she said. Iris leaned in. The signer on the sale document was written as Eleanor Vance. The fair entry also signed Eleanor Vance had the same name, but not the same hand. At first the difference was subtle. Then once Iris saw it, it became impossible not to see. The E on the fair entry opened wide, the lower loop slightly larger than the upper. The V in Vance curved back into itself, elegant and consistent, almost like a habit of motion. On the sale document, the E was tight, compressed. The V did not loop at all. Iris looked from one signature to the other. Bea's voice was quiet. The E is different. The V doesn't loop. Iris did not move. Bea said someone signed this for her. The room seemed to become very still. Outside the archive window, traffic moved past the courthouse. A phone rang somewhere beyond the door. A printer started and stopped. Ordinary county sounds continued around them, indifferent to the fact that a 50-year-old lie had just changed shape on the table. Iris looked at the 1978 transfer again. Eleanor Vance per Silas Vance, power of attorney. A woman who had no recorded illness. A woman winning dairy awards that same year. A farm that was not failing. A brother with debts. A signature that did not match. Bea looked at her. And it wasn't a lawyer, she said. Iris picked up the copy of the sale document and held it beside the fair entry. The house had hidden a trap door. The records had hidden a theft. And somewhere beneath the pantry floor, Iris was beginning to understand the tunnel was not just a passage under an old farmhouse. It was Nell Vance's last appeal. Iris returned to the Vance farm just before dusk. The drizzle had stopped, but the air still held the wet weight of it. The farmhouse stood at the end of the gravel track, in a gray hush, its white clapboard darkened slightly by the damp, its windows reflecting the low sky. Beyond it, the old dairy barn leaned into the evening, the way tired structures lean when they have survived, not because anyone cared for them, but because they were built too well to surrender quickly. In the back seat of her car lay a heavy-duty crowbar, a lantern, 2 pairs of gloves, and the folder Bea Lowe had given her before she left the county registry. Iris did not bring the folder inside first. She brought the crowbar. The pantry was colder than the kitchen. That seemed impossible at first. The 2 rooms shared a wall, a floor, a ceiling, but the pantry held a different temperature, as if the air beneath it had been rising slowly through the boards for decades and had changed the room by persistence alone. The rug was still folded back where Iris had left it. The trapdoor waited beneath it, wide plank oak, no handle, just the worn finger hole at one end darkened by use and time. Iris set the lantern on the pantry floor and pulled on her gloves. Then she placed 2 fingers into the hole and lifted. The door resisted. "Not stuck!" Heavy. She shifted her weight, used the crowbar carefully under the edge, and lifted again. The old hinges gave a low, metallic complaint, not a shriek, more like a sound being made after a long refusal to speak. The trapdoor rose. Cold air came up first. Not rotten air, not the wet, mold-sour breath of a collapsed cellar. This was different. Cool, mineral, earth and cedar and something faintly metallic beneath it, like old tools kept dry in a shed. Iris lifted the door all the way back and held the lantern over the opening. Below was not a cellar. It was a shaft. Stone-lined, narrow dropping, maybe 8 feet before it met a ladder fixed into the wall. The ladder was old but not improvised. Iron rungs set into stone, practical, deliberate, built for repeated use. Iris sat back on her heels. A farmhouse pantry with a hidden trapdoor was one thing. A stone shaft with a permanent ladder was another. Someone had not hidden a box here. Someone had built a way down. She lowered the lantern first, resting it on the second rung until its glow reached the bottom. Then she stepped onto the ladder. The iron was cold through her gloves. She descended slowly, one rung at a time, listening to her own breathing and the soft settling of the house above her. At the bottom, the shaft opened into a passage. The tunnel ran east. 30 feet, perhaps a little more. It was too narrow for comfort, but not crudely dug. The walls were stone at the lower half-packed earth above, reinforced at intervals with cedar beams darkened by age. The ceiling was low enough that Iris had to bend slightly as she moved. This was not a root cellar. It was a tunnel, a protected passage running under the kitchen and toward the old silo foundation. Iris stood still at the entrance and let her eyes adjust to the lantern light. The air smelled of damp earth, old metal, and cedar that had somehow held its character through decades underground. The sound of the farmhouse disappeared down here. No wind at the windows, no settling boards, only her breath, and now and then the faint drop of water, somewhere beyond the lantern's reach. She lifted the light. On the first cedar beam, written in pencil, were 3 words: "Dry, safe, 1978. Iris stepped closer. The handwriting was firm, narrow-angled slightly to the right. Not decorative, not hesitant. A working hand. She lifted the lantern higher and read it again. "Dry, safe, 1978. The same year as the sale. The same year the back 40 had been transferred for $1,200. The same year Nell Vance had supposedly needed Silas to sign for her. Iris reached out and touched the beam lightly with 2 fingers. The wood had been marked by the person who built or sealed this place. No one wrote dry and safe unless dryness and safety mattered. No one wrote a year on a cedar beam unless the year itself mattered. Nell had not simply hidden something. She had prepared a chamber to preserve it. Iris moved forward. The tunnel narrowed halfway through where the old stonework had shifted slightly but held. Cedar beams crossed overhead at regular intervals. On one of them faintly was another mark, not a sentence this time, just initials. NV, no date, no explanation. Just the same hidden name the kitchen had already given her. The lantern flame trembled as Iris passed beneath it. At the far end, the tunnel widened. Not into a room exactly. A chamber, small squared off, perhaps 6 feet across. Stone floor, low ceiling, a shelf built directly into the wall. A wooden stool stood near the side, one leg shorter than the other, stabilized with a wedge of folded leather beneath it. It looked impossibly like a miniature office. Not a hiding place someone used once in panic. A place someone had returned to. There were scrape marks on the floor near the stool. A dark stain on the stone where a lamp must have sat again and again. A nail in the wall with a scrap of cord still hanging from it. Iris imagined Nell Vance here in 1978. 76 years old? Still sharp, still working, still winning dairy ribbons while her brother sold her land through a signature that was not hers. Coming down through the pantry, carrying records in her apron or under her coat. writing on cedar beams because she needed someone someday to know when the truth had been placed here. On the shelf sat the milk urn, large, vintage, metal gone dark with rust. The sides dented in 2 places, the old handle folded down against the lid. It was the kind of urn that had once moved between barn and creamery, heavy with morning labor, touched daily by hands that knew the weight of milk and time. But this one had not carried milk for decades. The lid was sealed, not simply stuck, sealed. A strip of lead had been pressed across the lid and body flattened by a tool, then stamped with something Iris could not make out in the dim light. She set the lantern on the stone floor. The chamber became smaller with the light below her. Her breathing sounded louder. She put both hands on the urn and tried to lift it. It was heavier than she expected. Not full of liquid, full of something that had weight because it had waited. Iris braced the urn against the wall and worked the crowbar carefully under the lead seal. The first attempt slipped. The metal gave a dull clink against stone that seemed too loud in the tunnel. She stopped. Listen. Nothing answered. She tried again, slower this time, pressing not to break the urn but to separate what had been closed. The lead bent, then cracked. The sound was small, final. Iris lifted the broken seal away and set it on the shelf. The lid came loose with a low scrape. Inside was oilcloth, a roll of it tied with cotton cord, dry to the touch. Nell had chosen well. Dry, safe. Iris did not untie it there. She could have. The lantern gave enough light. Her hands were steady enough. But something in her resisted opening Nell's papers underground in the dark, bent beneath the weight of the house. Whatever was inside this urn had been hidden in darkness long enough. It deserved a table. Light. Air. Iris wrapped the oilcloth against her chest, tucked the broken seal, and lid back onto the urn, and looked once around the chamber before leaving. The stool. The shelf. The pencil marks. The urn. The small stone room under a farmhouse everyone had called a failure. A woman had made this place into an archive because every official room above ground had failed her. Iris climbed back through the tunnel slowly. The lantern threw her shadow against the cedar beams, long and uneven, crossing over Nell's penciled words one last time before she reached the ladder. Dry safe, 1978. At the shaft, she climbed carefully, one hand holding the oilcloth bundle against her side. The kitchen light above looked strangely bright after the tunnel almost too ordinary. She pushed the bundle through first, then climbed out after it. For a moment, she sat on the pantry floor with her back against the shelves, breathing harder than she wanted to admit. Her hands had begun to shake, not from fear, from the knowledge that she was holding something someone had trusted to the earth for half a century. She took the bundle to the kitchen table, the same table that had probably held pails ledgers, meals, bills, letters, and the ordinary mathematics of a dairy farm for more than 100 years. Iris set the oilcloth in the center. She did not rush. She removed her gloves, untied the cotton cord, unfolded the oilcloth one layer at a time. Inside was a rolled parchment, old but intact, dry, preserved. She unrolled the first paper, carefully pressing the edges flat with both hands. At the top was the county seal. Beneath it, the date, June 12th, 1928. Iris read the first line. Then she read it again. Original land grant to Eleanor Vance for her sole and separate use. Not Vance Holdings, not Silas Vance, not Arthur, not the family. Eleanor Vance. Nell, for her sole and separate use. Iris sat at the kitchen table in the abandoned farmhouse and felt the entire story shift under her hands. The back 40 had not been family land that Silas had mismanaged. It had been Nell's land, hers alone. And if this document was real, then the 1978 sale had not merely been unfair. It had been theft wearing a county stamp. Iris looked toward the pantry, toward the open trap door, toward the tunnel beneath the house where Nell had carried the proof after the world above ground stopped listening. The lawyer had called this a skeleton of a farm. But skeletons, Iris knew, were not empty. They were structure. They were what remained after everything soft had been stripped away. And on the kitchen table in front of her in ink that had survived longer than the lie built over it was the bone of the truth. Iris did not sleep much that night. She stayed in the kitchen of the abandoned farmhouse with the papers from the milk urn spread across the table, the trapdoor still open in the pantry behind her, and the sound of the old house settling around her as if it were listening. At first she had only opened the land grant. That had been enough to change everything. Original land grant, June 12, 1928, to Eleanor Vance for her sole and separate use. Not Vance Holdings, not Silas Vance, not the family estate. Eleanor Vance. Nell. But there was more inside the oilcloth. Much more. By morning, pale light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table in long, uneven bands. Iris made coffee she forgot to drink. Then she began arranging the contents of the milk urn in careful order. She had spent her life studying evidence in the field soil composition, root patterns, plant succession, water movement. The work had taught her that truth rarely arrived as one dramatic fact. It arrived as layers, a seed here, a change in slope, a missing species, a line of trees where no fence remained. The milk urn was the same, a preserved ecosystem of proof. The first item after the land grant was a ledger, thick, leather-bound, darkened at the corners from decades of handling. The cover had no title stamped on it, only 2 initials in faded ink on the inside page. EV. Then below that in smaller writing, Milk Production, 1938. Iris turned the first page, then the next, then the next. Day after day, month after month, year after year. Every entry written by the same hand. Morning yield, evening yield, butterfat percentage, feed cost, creamery payment, veterinary expense, repairs, weather, calving notes, names of cows, notes on temperament. Bessie Strong morning yield restless in heat. June low appetite check left hoof. Mabel best butterfat this week. Iris sat back slowly. This was not the record of a failing farm. This was the record of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Nell Vance had not simply milked cows and hoped the numbers worked out. She had tracked everything. She had studied patterns. She had adjusted feed before production fell. She had matched breeding to yield. She had noted which fields produced better hay after wet springs and which animals lost condition during hard winters. She had run the dairy like a business, a precise one, a brilliant one. Iris turned to the late 1960s and early 1970s. The handwriting had changed slightly with age, but not with carelessness. The numbers remained steady. In some years, they improved. The farm was not dying. The farm was efficient, profitable, alive. Iris looked toward the window, toward the meadow beyond the barn, toward the land everyone had called useless. "They lied about you," she said softly. The kitchen did not answer. It did not need to. The next bundle held letters. Railroad letterhead, North-South Railway expansion. The first was dated February 1977, addressed not to Eleanor Vance, to Silas Vance. Iris read it once, then again. The company was interested in the back acreage for possible access, staging, water, and gravel movement connected to a planned rail expansion. The tone was polite, professional, interested, but cautious. The second letter was more specific. Mr. Vance has discussed the parcel behind the dairy structure remains of particular interest due to its access to the old well and the existing grade. Iris stopped. The well. She pulled the old soil map Bea had copied for her from the folder and spread it beside the letters. The back 40 had not been just open land. It held the hidden well, a deep one, old, reliable. The kind of water source that made a dairy farm viable through dry seasons, the kind of thing that would not look important to someone reading only a parcel description, but would matter to anyone who had worked the land. Iris read the next letter, again addressed to Silas. Mr. Vance, we understand your sister is no longer able to manage the property directly. Please confirm that your authority to negotiate on behalf of Vance Holdings remains in effect. Iris's jaw tightened. Your sister. Not Eleanor. Not the owner. Not the woman whose name was on the 1928 land grant. Your sister. No longer able to manage? She picked up the fair entry Bea had printed for her the day before and placed it beside the railroad letter. September 1978. Eleanor Nell Vance Blue Ribbon Dairy Production. No recorded illness. No guardianship. No incapacity. Winning county recognition for the same farm Silas was quietly selling out from under her. The next railroad letter was dated May 1978. It referred to Mrs. Vance's condition and the urgency of completing sale paperwork before further delays complicate the expansion schedule. Iris put the paper down. There it was. Not a misunderstanding. Not family confusion. A narrative. Silas had told the railroad that Nell was incapacitated. He had made her disappear before the papers erased her. The third bundle was smaller, one folded page. No letterhead. No formal structure. Only handwriting. Nell's handwriting. Dated October 1978. Iris held the page for several seconds before reading it. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. Silas says the debt is mine. He says the signature is legal. He says if I fight him, he will tell the town I have lost my mind. I am hiding this here. Let the soil keep what the family would not. Iris read the final sentence again. Let the soil keep what the family would not. For a long moment she could not move. The horror of it was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was not the kind that arrived all at once. It was worse because it was administrative. A brother with debts, a sister with land, a railroad that wanted water and access, a signature that did not match, a town willing to believe an aging woman had lost her mind because it was easier than believing her brother had stolen from her. Iris laid Nell's note beside the milk ledger. The contrast was unbearable. On one side, 40 years of competence, daily proof of discipline, intelligence, memory, judgment, and work. On the other, one page written by a woman cornered by the lie that she was no longer capable of understanding her own life. The fourth item was a map, hand-drawn, not by a surveyor, but by someone who knew the farm intimately. The farmhouse, the dairy barn, the silo, the back 40, the slope line, the old access road, the hidden well marked with a small circle and 3 short lines radiating from it. Beside the well, Nell had written, "Main water, do not lose." Iris looked out the kitchen window. Beyond the meadow past the broken fence, the land dropped toward the back acreage. She could not see all of it from the house, but she could see enough to change in grade, the scrub growth, the pale stretch where gravel showed through the grass. A gravel pit now? That was what the lawyer had called it. The back 40 was a gravel pit. The well would be gone. Or buried. Or fenced off. Sold to the railroad first, used, stripped, forgotten. Iris stood and walked to the window. The fields did not look angry. Land never did. Land simply held what had been done to it. Nell had not lost the farm to the economy. She had not lost it because she was too old. She had not lost it because dairy work had become impossible. She lost it because Silas Vance had needed money and had discovered that his sister's silence was cheaper than honesty. He had sold the water, the one thing that made the farm viable. He had sold the back 40 for $1,200 and then watched everyone call the farm a failure after he had cut the heart out of it. Iris returned to the table. She opened the milk ledger to 1978. The entries changed in September, not dramatically at first. Nell's handwriting remained steady, but the notes became shorter. The daily yields began to fluctuate. There were comments about hauling water, about dry troughs, about Silas says temporary, about Bessie low, about Arthur worried. Then in October, one line, no water from South Well. Then another, had to sell 3 cows. Then written smaller near the margin, he says I signed. Iris closed her eyes. When she opened them, the kitchen seemed different, not abandoned, witnessing. The ledger, the letters, the land grant, the map, the note. A woman had known exactly what was happening to her, and every public record had been arranged to make her look like the confused one. Iris placed Nell's note at the center of the table. Let the soil keep what the family would not. Then she looked toward the pantry, toward the open trap door, toward the tunnel that had held Nell's evidence with more loyalty than her own blood had shown her. A movement outside caught her eye. Iris turned. At the far fence line beyond the yard, near the old track that led toward the neighboring property, a tractor sat idling. Old green paint, one headlight out. exhaust lifting in a thin line into the morning air. A man sat on it. He was elderly, broad-shouldered, despite age, wearing a dark cap pulled low. He did not wave. He did not drive closer. He simply sat there looking toward the farmhouse, toward the kitchen window, toward Iris. She knew who he was before she had been told. Raymond Vance, Silas's grandson. The man who lived on the adjoining property, the man whose family had inherited what remained after Silas's debts and lies had been buried under county language. Iris stood very still. Raymond did not look surprised. That was the part that mattered. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had expected this day for a long time and dreaded it just as long. Iris looked back at the table, at Nell's ledger, at the railroad letters, at the map of the well, at the note that had turned the entire farmhouse into testimony. Then she looked again at Raymond Vance sitting on his tractor outside the fence. He knew. Maybe not everything. Maybe not the legal shape of it. But he knew the family story had a buried center, and he had lived close enough to it to hear the ground shift. Iris picked up Nell's note and held it in her hand. Let the soil keep what the family would not. Outside, Raymond still did not move. But he did not leave either. And that Iris understood was its own kind of confession. Iris did not take the deed with her. She left the 1928 land grant on the kitchen table, waited at the corners with a coffee mug, the broken lead seal from the milk urn, and the flat stone she had found beside the trap door. It did not feel right to carry it across the field like an accusation before she understood what Raymond Vance knew. Instead, she carried the milk urn, empty now. Rusted, dented, but heavier than it had been when she first pulled it from the tunnel. Some objects change weight after they have done their work. The morning had cleared into a pale, hard light. The farmhouse behind her looked less abandoned now than watchful. The pantry trap door remained open. The kitchen table held Nell's ledger, the railroad letters the map of the hidden well, and the handwritten note dated October 1978. Let the soil keep what the family would not. Iris crossed the yard slowly. Raymond Vance saw her coming. He was still on the tractor near the fence line, the engine idling low, one gloved hand resting on the wheel. He did not startle when she approached. He did not look away. He simply watched her with the exhausted stillness of a man who had already lived this meeting many times in his mind and had finally run out of ways to delay it. When Iris reached the fence, Raymond shut off the tractor. The sudden silence felt larger than the engine had. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Iris lifted the empty milk urn slightly. "I was in the tunnel," she said. Raymond closed his eyes. "Not long." Just long enough for Iris to see that the words had landed exactly where she expected them to land. When he opened his eyes again, something in his face had changed. Not surprise, not fear, more like surrender. "I found Nell's ledger," Iris said. Raymond's shoulders dropped. The movement was small, but it seemed to remove decades from his posture and add them back all at once. He looked toward the farmhouse, then toward the old back acreage beyond the broken fence, the land that had once held the well and now lay pale and scarred under gravel and scrub. "My grandfather said she was difficult," Raymond said. His voice was low, rough with age. "He said that all my life. Nell was difficult. Nell was proud. Nell didn't understand business. Nell let the farm fail because she wouldn't listen." He gave a quiet, humorless breath. "People repeat what they inherit." Iris said nothing. Raymond looked at the milk urn in her hands. "Then one day you find out what you inherited wasn't a story," he said. "It was a hiding place." He climbed down from the tractor slowly. His knees were stiff, but he did not ask for help, and Iris did not offer. He opened the gate between the properties and stepped aside. "Come on," he said. "If you found the ledger, then you need to see the rest." Raymond's house sat on the rise west of the old Vance farmhouse. It was newer by decades, built in the 1960s, brick practical, with a porch that looked out toward the land his grandfather had kept and the land his grandfather had taken. The yard was neat. The fences were repaired. The tractor shed had been freshly painted. It was a house that had been maintained. That made Iris think of Nell's house across the field, cleared of its name, emptied of photographs left to hold its truth underground. Raymond led her inside without ceremony. The living room smelled faintly of coffee wood polish and old paper. On one wall hung photographs of men standing beside tractors, barns, cattle trucks, county fair ribbons. Silas appeared in several of them, younger than Iris had imagined, square-jawed, handsome, in the way men sometimes are before age reveals what their choices have done to them. Raymond did not look at the photographs. He walked to the hallway and pulled down the attic stairs. After my father died, he said I cleaned out the attic. That was 1995. I found a satchel in the insulation behind the chimney. He began climbing. Iris followed. The attic was low and warm with exposed rafters and a single bare bulb. Dust lay over old boxes, broken furniture, rolled fencing plans, and a trunk with a cracked leather handle. Raymond moved carefully to the far wall, knelt beside the chimney stack, and reached behind a loose panel. When he brought his hand back, he was holding a leather satchel.
Dark brown?
Dry. The strap cracked with age. He set it on an old steamer trunk between them. For a moment he kept both hands on it.
My grandfather's, he said.
Then he opened it. Inside were papers bundled loosely, a pocket notebook, receipts, a few letters, and a diary with a black cover, the corners worn soft from handling. Raymond took out the diary. 1979, he said. He opened to a marked page. The paper had yellowed. The writing was cramped, uneven, harder to read than Nell's steady hand. Raymond looked at the page for a long time before speaking. Then he read, "Nell knows." His voice caught on the first two words. He cleared his throat and continued. She didn't scream. She didn't call the police. She didn't go to town. She came to the house and stood in the parlor with her coat still wet from the rain. Raymond paused. Iris could hear the old house settling beneath them. He read on. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "I hope the money was worth the name Silas." The attic seemed to close around the sentence. Raymond lowered the diary slightly. Iris did not speak. There were some lines that should not be interrupted when they returned to daylight. Raymond looked down again. "I can't sleep in this house any more," he read. "Every board knows, every field knows. She did not curse me. She did not raise her voice. That was worse." He stopped. His thumb rested on the page. "My grandfather wrote that in February 1979, he said. 4 months after the transfer." Iris looked at the diary. "Did he know she had hidden proof?" "I don't think so," Raymond said. "Not then." He closed the diary but kept one finger inside the page. "He spent the $1,200 in 2 weeks." Iris looked at him. 2 weeks? Track debts, private notes, a man from across the county who came twice and left angry both times. Raymond's mouth tightened. "My father said Silas walked around for years like the walls were listening to him." "They were," Iris said quietly. Raymond nodded once.
Yes!
He set the diary down on the trunk. "She never spoke to him again," he said. "Not one word. He saw her in town sometimes, at the feed store, at the fairgrounds, outside church. She would pass him like he was a fence post." "And the farm?" Raymond looked toward the small attic window. From there, the roofline of Nell's farmhouse was visible across the field. "She moved out of the main house after the water was gone. That's what my father told me. She moved into the old creek shack, said the big house had too many ghosts. People thought she was proud. Some thought she was losing her mind. Silas let them think it." His voice hardened slightly. "She let the town think she was the one who failed." Iris thought of the milk ledger, the clean numbers, the daily entries, the blue ribbons, the fair signatures, the map marked Main Water. Do not lose. Nell had not failed. She had been cut off from the very thing that made the farm live. Raymond reached back into the satchel and removed another folded document. "This came later." He handed it to Iris. The paper was dated 1980, a formal inquiry. Silas Vance attempting to repurchase a portion of the transferred land from North-South Railway expansion.
Rejected.
The reason was written in clean corporate language. Railway access use completed. Water source compromised by excavation. Parcel no longer viable for original agricultural function. Iris read the line twice. Water source compromised. "He tried to buy it back," Raymond said. "Why?" "I don't know if it was guilt or fear. Maybe both. But by then it was too late. The well was damaged. The land was carved up. The farm couldn't support the dairy the way it had. He looked at the diary. He sold the heart and tried to buy back the body. Iris folded the document carefully. Raymond sat on the trunk opposite her. He looked older in the attic, light, not just 76, but weighted by years that had not belonged entirely to him and had still taken their payment. "I found all of this in 1995, he said. Iris looked up. Raymond did not look away. "I was 47, old enough to know what it meant, young enough to tell myself it was too late to matter." He gave a small, bitter smile. "That's what cowards call convenience. Too late." He picked up the diary again. "I told myself I was protecting the family name." Iris held the empty milk urn in her lap. Raymond looked at it. "But the name was already ruined," he said. "Not because Nell found out, because Silas did it." The attic was quiet. Below them, somewhere in the house, a clock ticked steadily. Raymond's voice lowered. "I've had that diary since 1995. I was too ashamed to show it to anyone. I thought if I kept it quiet, the Vance name would stay clean." He swallowed. "But it's been dirty for 50 years. Iris let the words sit. Outside the attic window, the old Vance farmhouse stood across the field, its white siding dull in the afternoon light. Its pantry floor, open its tunnel, no longer sealed its table, covered in the evidence a woman had trusted to earth when blood had failed her. Raymond leaned forward and placed the diary on top of the folded 1980 document. Then he pushed both toward Iris. "I don't want to be the man who keeps it buried after someone finally found the door." Iris looked at the diary, then at Raymond. "Why now?" she asked. Raymond's face shifted, not defensively. "Painfully. Because when you walked out of that farmhouse carrying the milk urn, I saw Nell." He looked down at his hands. "I never knew her well. I was a boy when she died, but I remember her once at the county fair. She was standing beside that old cow Bessie, I think, and people kept coming by to congratulate her. She didn't smile much, but she stood straight." He paused. "My grandfather stood 20 yards away and wouldn't look at her." Iris thought of the photograph still missing from the story. Nell with Bessie, the woman behind the ledger, the farmer behind the erased name. Raymond nodded toward the diary. "Take it," he said. "Take all of it. B-Lo will know what to do with copies. The county may not be able to undo every wrong, but they can stop calling it a failed farm." Iris put the 1980 document and the diary into the leather satchel. She did not thank him immediately. Gratitude was not wrong, but it was not large enough for the moment. "You understand this will change the way people talk about your grandfather," she said. Raymond looked toward the attic window. "They should have changed that a long time ago." Iris stood with the satchel in one hand and the empty milk urn in the other. At the attic stairs, Raymond spoke again. "Iris." She turned. He was still sitting on the trunk, shoulders bent now, both hands clasped between his knees. "When you put her name back, he said don't soften what he did." Iris studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. "I won't." Raymond looked relieved and wounded by the same answer. Maybe that was the proper shape of truth when it finally arrived late. Iris climbed down from the attic, carrying Silas's confession. Behind her, Raymond stayed where he was for a while longer in the attic of the house his grandfather had not been able to sleep in, listening to the silence that remained after one burden had finally been handed away. By the time Iris returned to the county archive, the milk urn no longer felt empty. She had carried it from the tunnel to Raymond's house, from Raymond's attic, back across the field, and then into B-Lo's office, where the rusted metal now sat on the corner of a records table, beside Silas Vance's diary, the 1980 rejection letter, Nell's milk ledger, and the 1928 land grant. The urn held no papers now. Still, it changed the room. Some objects did that. They arrived emptied of their contents and somehow carried more weight than before. B did not speak for a long time after reading Silas's diary entry. "Nell knows." She didn't scream. She didn't call the police. She just looked at me and said, "I hope the money was worth the name Silas." B read that line twice. Then she removed her glasses and set them on the table. She knew B said, "Yes," and she chose silence. Iris looked down at the ledger, at the steady columns of milk production, at the names of cows written with more tenderness than most families gave each other. No, Iris said quietly. She chose control over the only thing they had not taken from her. Bee looked at her. Her dignity. Iris nodded. That afternoon, Bee pulled the social care records from 1979 through 1981. They came from a thin gray folder in the county's public assistance index, thinner than Iris expected. There was no long case file, no guardianship petition, no institutional record, no official declaration that Eleanor Vance had become unable to manage herself. Only 3 short entries. The first, dated March 1979, noted that a county visitor had attempted to offer temporary housing assistance after reports that Miss Vance had relocated from the family farmhouse. The second noted that Miss Vance declined. The third, written in a different hand, said, "Subject refuses state aid, states she has sufficient garden creamery income and personal provisions." Iris read the line slowly. Garden, creamery income, personal provisions. Bee opened another file. "These are creamery consultant payments," she said. "Small checks, not many, but regular." The invoices listed Eleanor Vance as an independent consultant for herd nutrition, milk sanitation, and small dairy efficiency. A few farms had paid her for advice, not charity, not assistance, work. She was still advising dairies, Iris asked. Until a few months before she died, Bee said. Not full-time, not public. But people who actually knew dairy work still came to her. Iris thought of the town story. Eccentric Nell, proud Nell, difficult Nell, failed Nell. Then she looked at the creamery invoices. The town had called her eccentric because that was easier than admitting a master farmer was living in a shack on the edge of land stolen from her. Bee found the old property sketch next. There was a cabin, she said. Here. She circled a point near the creek just beyond the old fence line, but still within walking distance of the farmhouse. Not much of one. County records call it a field shelter. But there was a chimney. Iris looked at the marked point. Can we go? Bee was already reaching for her coat. They drove out in Iris's car past the courthouse, past the old feed store, and back down the road toward the Vance farmstead. The sky had lowered again, not raining, but heavy with the threat of it. The fields beyond the barn were quiet, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty once you knew what had happened there. They parked near the broken fence and walked along the edge of the property. Bee carried copies in a folder beneath her arm. Iris carried nothing but a flashlight and a small field trowel she had taken from her car without thinking. Old habits. Botanists carried tools because land often answered through what was half buried. The creek was lower than Iris expected, a narrow thread of water moving through brown grass and exposed stone. On the rise above it, partly hidden by sumac and wild blackberry, stood the chimney. That was all. A short stone stack, weathered but upright, blackened inside with weeds growing through gaps near the base. Around it, the faint outline of a foundation remained. Not a true foundation, only a rectangle of stones where walls had once stood. 12 by 12, perhaps. Maybe less. Iris stopped at the edge of it. This was where she lived. Bea did not answer. The contrast was too sharp for immediate speech. Nell Vance, who had run one of the most efficient dairy farms in the county. Nell Vance, whose milk ledger recorded 40 years of production with mathematical precision. Nell Vance, who knew her cows by name and her land by waterline. Nell Vance, original owner of the back 40. Reduced by theft, lies, and family silence to a 12 by 12 shack by the creek. Not because she had failed, because the people around her had preferred the story of her failure to the inconvenience of her truth. Iris stepped inside the stone outline. There was not much to see at first. Wet leaves, old ash, fragments of rusted metal, a few pieces of blue glass, the collapsed remains of something that might once have been a stoveplate. Then, near the chimney base, half under a mat of grass, she saw the curve of a handle. She crouched and cleared the earth with her fingers. A rusted milk pail. Small. Dented. The bottom mostly gone. Iris lifted it carefully. It left a dark ring in the soil. Bee came closer. The pail had no value as an artifact in the grand sense. It was not rare. It was not intact. It was the kind of object most people would throw away without thinking. But Iris held it for a long moment, because Nell had kept it, Because even here, even after the dairy was broken, after the well was compromised, after the town began saying she had failed, she had stayed close to the language of her life. Milk pail, garden, creamery checks, consulting invoices. A woman stripped of her farm had still refused to become only what had been done to her. She stayed here to watch the land, Iris said. Bee looked toward the back 40 where gravel showed pale through the grass beyond the broken fence. Yes, and to keep the tunnel hidden. Bee nodded slowly. The thought settled between them. Nell had not simply hidden the documents in 1978 and walked away. She had remained near them. Not in the farmhouse, perhaps, because Silas had made it impossible, or because the rooms had become unbearable, or because dignity sometimes required leaving the place others expected you to beg for. But she had stayed close. Close enough to watch the land. Close enough to know if the farmhouse was disturbed. Close enough to guard the truth without speaking it. Iris looked back at the chimney. She was waiting, she said, for someone she could trust, or maybe just for time to become kinder than people had been. Bee opened the folder and removed the death record. She did not hand it to Iris immediately. She looked at it first, and Iris knew from her expression that official language had once again found a way to make the truth smaller. At last, Bee passed it over. Eleanor Vance. Date of death 1981. 'Cause natural. Occupation retired. Iris read the final word twice. Retired. Bee whispered it before Iris could speak. Retired. The word sat inside the ruined outline of the shack like an insult. Not farmer. Not dairy woman. Not founder. Not landowner. Not victim of fraud. Retired. She was a master farmer. Bee said, her voice low, who died in a 12-by-12 shack because she wouldn't ruin her brother's life with the truth. Iris looked at the death record, then at the milk pail, then at the chimney. For a moment, anger rose in her clean and sharp. Not the loud kind, the useful kind, the kind that clarifies what must be done next. But under it was something deeper. Respect! Nell's silence had not been weakness. That was what everyone had mistaken. Silence could be fear. It could be shame. It could be surrender. But Nell's silence had been none of those. It had been refusal. She had refused to let Silas decide the shape of her soul, refused to become the town spectacle, refused to spend her final years begging people to believe what she had already preserved in earth cedar oilcloth ink and numbers. She had not screamed because the evidence was louder. She had not called the police because she had understood that the law had already allowed a lie to wear a signature. She had not ruined the family name because she knew the family name had already been ruined by the man who betrayed it. So she had done what farmers did. She had planted truth where it could survive. And then she had stayed near enough to make sure it did. Iris turned toward the chimney again. The stonework was rough but deliberate. Not mason's work, perhaps, but steady hands. On the west side, half hidden beneath lichen, one stone had a flatter face than the others. Iris brushed it with her sleeve. There were marks, not natural scratches. Letters. She leaned closer. Bee stepped beside her. Together they cleared the lichen carefully from the stone. The carving was shallow but still there. Vance Farm, 1928 to 1978. Iris touched the numbers with one finger. 50 years! Not the dates of Nell's life, the dates of her ownership, the dates of the truth. Bee exhaled softly. The land remembers, she said. Iris looked across the field toward the farmhouse, toward the pantry floor, toward the tunnel where Nell had trusted the soil with what her family would not keep. The town had erased her from records. Silas had erased her from the sale. Death had reduced her to retired. But here on the chimney of the shack where she had chosen to spend her final years, Nell had written the only title that mattered. Vance Farm. 1928 to 1978. Not Silas's farm. Not failed farm. Not worthless acreage. Vance Farm. Iris stood there until the light began to shift. Then she folded the death record and placed it back in Bee's folder. We're going to correct it, she said. Bee looked at her. The title, the registry, the historical record, the story people tell when they say this name. She looked once more at the chimney stone. Nell gave up everything to protect a family name, Iris said. Now we make sure that name actually means something again. Bee nodded. At the edge of the ruined cabin, Iris set the rusted milk pail gently beside the chimney. Not as trash, not as evidence to be removed. As a marker, a small witness returned to the place where it belonged. Then she took one last look at the carving. Vance Farm, 1928 to 1978. The land had remembered. Now it was their turn. Iris drove to the town cemetery just before sunset. She brought 3 things with her: a copy of the 1928 land grant, a photocopy of the final page from Nell's 1978 milk ledger, and the small photograph Bee had found tucked between 2 ledger pages that afternoon, Nell Vance standing beside a broad-faced Guernsey cow with one hand resting on the animal's neck, her posture straight, her boots muddy, her expression unsmiling but unmistakably proud. Bessie. The name was written on the back in pencil. Nell and Bessie, County Fair, 1978. The road to the cemetery curved behind the old church and rose gently toward a hill lined with maple trees. Iris parked near the iron gate and sat for a moment with the folder on the passenger seat. She had spent the day in records. Now she was going to the place records ended. The Vance family plot was easy to find. That was the first cruelty. It sat on the higher side of the cemetery beneath 2 old maples surrounded by a low stone border. The name Vance was carved across a large granite marker in letters deep enough to survive another century. Smaller stones stood around it in neat rows, all polished, all permanent, all placed by people who had understood what public memory looked like when it was purchased correctly. Silas Vance was there. His headstone was larger than the others. Silas Raymond Vance, 1906 to 1984, beloved brother, faithful son, keeper of the land. Iris stood in front of that line for a long time. Keeper of the land. The phrase looked almost peaceful in stone. That was the danger of stone, she thought. It could make a lie look settled. Bee stood beside her, silent. They had searched the cemetery records before coming. Eleanor Vance was listed in the same cemetery, but not in the Vance plot, not beside her parents, not near Silas, not within the low stone border where the family name had been protected with granite and space. Nell was in the lower section. Pauper's Row, the part of the cemetery where the ground dipped and the grass grew unevenly, where older markers had sunk into the soil, and newer ones were thin metal tags on iron stakes. It was the section used for people whose estates could not pay for burial, or whose families did not pay, or whose names had become inconvenient before their bodies became the county's responsibility. Iris walked slowly down the hill. The air changed there. Not colder exactly, less tended. The maple leaves did not fall evenly on Pauper's Row. They gathered in damp pockets around the tags and half-buried stones. A few wooden crosses remained, but most had rotted into short, dark stubs or disappeared entirely. Bee checked the cemetery map. Row 17, she said softly. Marker 23. They counted. 17, 20, 21, 22, 23. There was no stone. Only a small metal tag rusted at the edges, fixed to a narrow stake leaning slightly to one side. Events. 1981. That was all. For a moment, Iris could not move. Not because she had expected better, because part of her had. Even after the death record, even after the shack by the creek, even after the ledger, the forged signature, the stolen well, the silence, the erased name, some part of her had expected the world to have corrected one thing by accident. It had not. Silas had granite. Nell had a number. Bee looked down at the metal tag. She should have been in the family plot. Yes, Iris said. Her voice sounded different to her, lower, steadier. She should have had a farm. She knelt carefully in the grass. The soil was damp under her knees. She placed the folder beside her and took out the photograph first. Nell and Bessie. County Fair, 1978. In the photo, Nell stood like a woman who owned her own life. Not loudly, not defiantly, simply with the natural authority of someone who had done the work and knew the work had value. Behind her, blurred in the fairground background, were ribbons fencing people in hats, a child pointing toward the cow. Iris turned the photograph over. Bessie. a name written with care. She set the photograph beside the metal tag. Then she unfolded the copy of the milk ledger. She had chosen one page from September 1978, the last full month before the note in the tunnel, the last full month before everything in Nell's handwriting began to tighten around loss. Iris read aloud, not loudly. There was no audience except B, the cemetery grass, and whatever remains of truth gather around the places where the wrong people were buried too quietly. September 3rd. Morning yield 148 pounds. Evening yield 139. Bessie high, butterfat. Mabel restless. June steady. She paused. The wind moved through the lower grass. September 9th. Creamery payment received. Feed ratio adjusted. South well clear. Her voice faltered slightly on that line. South well clear. Before Silas sold it. Before the water was compromised. Before the farm's heart was cut out and everyone called the body a failure. Iris kept reading. September 18th. County Fair results. Bessie first in class. Herd commendation. Production steady. She looked down at the metal tag. You didn't fail, Nell? The words came before she had planned them. She did not take them back. You were the only one who didn't. Bee turned away slightly. Not to hide tears exactly. To give Iris the dignity of speaking without being watched too closely. Iris sat back on her heels and looked up the hill toward the Vance plot. From where she knelt, she could see Silas's granite marker between the trees. Large, clean, honored, keeper of the land. Below it in the lower ground, Nell Vance lay under a metal tag with no first name complete enough to hold her. The injustice of it was not new. It had simply found another form. Iris placed the copy of the 1928 land grant on her lap and opened it carefully. Original land grant to Eleanor Vance for her sole and separate use. She read that line aloud, too. Then again, to Eleanor Vance, she said, for her sole and separate use. The cemetery seemed to take the words differently than the archive had. In the archive, the line had been evidence. Here it was a restoration. Small, temporary. Not enough, but real. The sun lowered behind the trees. The metal tag caught one brief strip of light and then lost it. Iris sat there as the evening gathered. She thought of the farmhouse pantry, the tunnel, the cedar beam marked dry, safe, 1978. The milk urn, the ledger, the shack chimney, the carving. Vance Farm, 1928 to 1978. She thought of Nell moving through the years with the kind of dignity people mistake for passivity when they are not paying attention. Nell had not shouted the truth into a town eager not to hear it. She had placed it where soil, cedar, metal, and paper could hold it until a stranger came along who knew that absence was not emptiness. Iris took the small trowel from her coat pocket. Bee looked at her. Iris did not explain immediately. She moved to the foot of the grave just beyond the metal tag and pressed the trowel into the damp ground. The soil gave way easily. She dug a small, careful hollow, not deep, not hidden from shame, but placed with intention. Then she took a folded copy of the 1928 deed from the folder. Not the original. The original was protected. This was a copy on clean archival paper sealed in a clear protective sleeve. She held it for a moment. Then she placed it in the ground at the foot of Nell's grave. Bee said nothing. Iris covered it with soil, pressing the earth gently with her palm. "You're back on your own land now," she said. The words were not legally true. Not yet. The cemetery was not the back 40. The deed copy did not change title. The grave remained in Pauper's Row. The metal tag still leaned in the grass. But justice did not always arrive all at once. Sometimes it began as a sentence said where silence had lasted too long. Iris picked up the photograph of Nell and Bessie and held it in both hands. In the fading light, Nell looked almost alive. Proud, unsurrendered. Owner of her own life, even in a photograph taken the year her brother stole the ground from beneath it. Iris placed the photograph back in the folder. Not to bury. Not yet. That image needed to be seen. The town needed to see it. The registry needed to see it. The historical society needed to see it. Raymond needed to see it beside Silas's diary so the family could no longer pretend the woman they had called difficult had been anything less than extraordinary. Iris stood slowly. Her knees hurt. She ignored them. Bea looked from the metal tag to the hill where Silas's headstone stood. "What do we do about that?" she asked. Iris followed her gaze. The granite marker was still visible through the maple trunks. Keeper of the land. "We don't erase him," Iris said. Bea looked at her. Iris closed the folder. "We correct him." The sun slipped lower. For a moment, the cemetery held both names in the same light. Silas on the hill, Nell in the lower ground, one protected by stone, the other by what had survived under floorboards and in milk urns and in the memory of soil. Iris looked down once more at the metal tag. "Not pauper," she said softly. Then she turned toward the path. Behind her, beneath a small covering of fresh earth, a copy of the 1928 deed rested at the foot of Eleanor Vance's grave. Not enough, but the beginning of enough. Iris took the 1928 land grant Nell's milk ledger, Silas Vance's diary, the 1980 rejected repurchase letter, the railroad correspondence, and the photograph of Nell with Bessie to the County Historical Society on a Monday morning. She did not carry them in a plastic folder. She carried them in a flat archival box Bea had given her, each document sleeve labeled and placed in the order the truth had revealed itself. First the land, then the work, then the theft, then the confession, then the woman. The director of the Historical Society was a man named Thomas Greer, 71 years old, careful with his hands and slower to speak than Iris expected. He read the 1928 land grant first, then the milk ledger, then the railroad letters addressed to Silas, then the sale document with the mismatched signature, then the diary. When he reached the line from Silas's 1979 entry, he stopped. "I hope the money was worth the name Silas." He took off his glasses. No one spoke for a long moment. On the table beside him, Nell's photograph rested in a clear sleeve. She stood beside Bessie at the 1978 county fair boots, muddy shoulders, straight one hand resting on the cow's neck, looking not like a woman history had defeated, but like a woman history had failed to understand. Thomas looked at the photograph, then at the ledger.
Then at Iris.
"This is not a family story," he said quietly. "This is a county record correction." Bea exhaled. "Yes," she said, "it is." The correction did not happen in one day. Things like that rarely did. There were title historians to consult registry notes, to review legal boundaries, to confirm railroad archives, to request and county minutes from 1978 to retrieve from storage. But the evidence did not soften under scrutiny. It hardened. The 1928 land grant was authentic. The 1978 sale was flagged for historical review. The signature discrepancy was entered into the county file. The railroad expansion sale could not be undone. The back 40 could not be unmined. The old well could not be restored by regret or documentation or finally spoken truth. But the record could be corrected. And sometimes after enough years of silence, correction was its own form of resurrection. 6 weeks later, the County Historical Society issued its formal amendment. Vance Dairy Farm, active 1928 to 1978. Founded, owned, and operated by Eleanor Nell Vance, recognized as one of the county's leading small dairy operations during the mid-20th century. Historical note. 1978 back acreage transfer under review due to evidence of disputed authorization and later family confession. Iris read the lines 3 times. Founded, owned, operated. Not eccentric, not failed, not retired. Not Silas Vance Farm. Eleanor Nell Vance. For the first time in half a century, the public record had spoken her name correctly. Raymond Vance came to the Historical Society the day the amendment was filed. He arrived in his old truck wearing the same dark cap he had worn on the tractor and stood in the doorway for a moment as if unsure whether the building would allow him in. Iris saw him and walked over. He held a folder in both hands. "I had my attorney prepare it," he said. His voice was steady, but his fingers tightened around the paper. Inside was a transfer agreement. Raymond was signing over the old farmhouse, the remaining acreage, the ruined dairy barn, the pantry tunnel, and the creek shack site to a nonprofit preservation trust. The name of the trust had already been typed on the first page, Nell Vance Heritage Farm. Iris looked up at him. Raymond did not smile. My grandfather took enough, he said. My part of the family kept enough. I can't give back the well. I can't give back the years. He looked down at the folder. But I can stop owning what never should have come to us. No one applauded. It would have been wrong to applaud. Raymond signed at the long oak table beneath a framed county map with B as witness and Thomas Greer standing behind him in silence. When the pen lifted from the final page, Raymond sat back as if some part of him had been holding his breath since 1995 and had only now remembered how to release it. The restoration began that spring, not a polished restoration. Not the kind that turns old places into clean museums where nothing smells of labor and every surface looks too corrected to be true. Iris would not allow that. The farmhouse was stabilized. The clapboard was repaired, not replaced where repair would do. The dairy barn was braced. The old fence line was marked. The creek shack chimney was left standing with a small protective rail around it and a plaque explaining what it was. The pantry was restored carefully. The bolted rug was preserved. The trapdoor was repaired. And the tunnel was left open, not exposed carelessly, not made theatrical. Open enough. Visitors could stand at the pantry threshold and look down into the stone-lined shaft, see the first cedar beam and read Nell's pencil mark, still faint but legible in the protected light. Dry safe, 1978. Beside the opening, the Historical Society installed a small display case. Inside it sat the broken lead seal from the milk urn, a copy of the 1928 land grant, a reproduction of the milk ledger page from September 1978, and a photograph of Nell with Bessie. Below the photograph was one sentence from Nell's note: "Let the soil keep what the family would not." Iris stood in front of that case for a long time the day it was installed. Then she walked to the kitchen door and closed it gently. Behind it at the height no one would have seen unless they stood exactly where she had stood on her first day. The small pine plaque remained. NV 1938. No one moved it. No one cleaned it too much. No one turned it into decoration. Some things Iris thought earned their power by surviving almost unseen. The cemetery correction came last. Raymond paid for the stone. He insisted on that. Not because payment repaired anything, but because some debts required a hand to reach toward them, even if the hand arrived late. The new headstone was placed in the Vance family plot. Not in Pauper's Row. Not beside the metal tag. In the family plot where she should have been all along. Next to Silas, larger than his. That had been Raymond's decision, too. On the morning it was set, a small group gathered beneath the maple trees. Iris! Bea. Raymond. Thomas Greer, 2 members of the Historical Society, a reporter from the county paper, and 3 older farmers who had come without being invited, men who remembered hearing their fathers mention Nell Vance's dairy with respect before the town learned to call her difficult. The stone was simple. Gray granite! Clean lettering. Eleanor Nell Vance, 1902 to 1981, founder and owner of Vance Dairy, Farm, the land remembers. Iris stood at the edge of the plot and looked from Nell's stone to Silas's. Silas Raymond Vance, beloved brother, faithful son, keeper of the land. No one removed his words. No one scratched them out. No one corrected the stone with anger. They simply placed the truth beside it, larger and harder to ignore. Raymond stood with his hat in his hands. He did not cry. But when the reporter asked him whether he wanted to make a statement, he shook his head and said only one sentence. My grandfather kept the land for a while. Nell kept the truth longer. That was printed in the county paper the next day. Iris cut out the clipping and placed it in the archive box beside Nell's photograph. By early summer, the farmhouse kitchen was ready. The floor had been cleaned but not made new. The pantry door still creaked. The table had been repaired and set back where it belonged. Morning light came through the east window and landed across the boards in a long, warm rectangle. Iris arrived before the others. She carried the milk urn herself. The rust had been stabilized, not polished away. Its dents remained. its old handle still folded down with a small metallic sound that made the kitchen feel suddenly full. She placed it on the windowsill, right beside the small plaque, NV 1938. For a moment, the two objects seemed to complete one another. The hidden name, the vessel that carried the proof, the mark Nell carved into the house, the urn Nell sealed beneath it. Iris stepped back. The morning light touched the urn first, then the plaque, then the table where the documents had first been unrolled after 50 years in the dark. Outside, the meadow moved in a soft wind. The dairy barn stood braced against the sky. Near the pantry, the trapdoor waited open, no longer a secret, no longer a wound, but a passage. Iris thought of Nell in the tunnel, 76 years old, carrying the land grant, the ledger, the letters, the note, writing dry, safe. 1978 on cedar because she understood better than anyone that truth needed conditions if it was going to survive. Not glory. Not revenge. Conditions. Dry. Safe. Hidden long enough to outlast the people who had reason to destroy it. Iris looked at the milk urn in the morning light. Nell Vance spent 50 years in the dark so that the truth would be safe for the light, she said softly. The farmhouse held the words. The kitchen. The pantry. The tunnel. The fields beyond. I think she knew it would take a long time. The light moved across the urn. I think she knew it was worth the wait. If you believe Nell's name deserved to be restored, subscribe. And tell me in the comments what's the oldest thing in your family that might still be holding a secret.